Yeah, yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to give this presentation. This is a topic that I love to talk about. And so it's locating images of ancestors, putting a face with that name. And I start out on this first page here with a photo of my great-great-grandfather. And his name was Thomas Lykins. And just a little bit of Pennsylvania connection. So his paternal ancestor, who was the immigrant, was Peter Nilsson Lykin, who was a settler in the New Sweden colony. And they were Finns who came in about 1654. And so that's my line of the family. And so I have a lot of New Sweden connections in Philadelphia. But this photo, that's my furthest back photo on my paternal line of my family. And Thomas Lykins was a Union soldier out of Iowa. And when I was a teenager, my grandmother gave this photo to me. And it's actually a tintype, which is just like the size of your thumbnail. And so it was fascinating to me to get this photo, and I wanted to know more about him. And so I started researching with my father and just learning what I could about the family. But it was so cool to see an image of him, because it just made him not just a name or a list of places and dates and things like that, but I could see who he was. And for me, there are several ways to make your genealogy come to life. So it's not just a list of names and places and dates, but if you can learn more family stories about someone, if you can put them in historical context, that's a wonderful thing. But for me, I just love it if I can find a photo of my ancestor or an image of some kind. And so that's what I'll be talking about this evening. Right. There we go. So connecting to the past. One thing I love about finding photos of ancestors is just seeing how traits have been passed down through families. And this is a photo of my daughter, and she's 25 years old now. But when she was born, we noticed that she had a cleft chin. And we thought, well, that's interesting because I don't have a cleft chin. My wife doesn't have a cleft chin. Our parents don't have cleft chins. And actually, none of our grandparents had cleft chins either. And so once the dust settled a bit and I started looking through old photos, we discovered that I had a great grandmother who had a cleft chin. My wife had a great grandfather who had a cleft chin also. So we don't know which side it came down from, but it was interesting that it had skipped so many generations. But that was kind of fun just to see how that trait had been passed down in the family. So as Chris mentioned, I've been interested in genealogy for as long as I can remember. I made a family tree in second grade, and I remember thinking that was pretty interesting. And so when I was a teenager, I started researching fairly seriously. And so my first thing was to try to find photos of the people in my family, in my immediate family to start with. And so there I am and my parents, and I knew 3 of my grandparents, so that wasn't difficult to get photos of that whole generation. And then with a little bit of searching, looking at grandma's house and my grandparents' house, seeing what I could find, I was able to locate images of all of my great-grandparents also. And 2 of them I even met, so that it took a little time, but it wasn't too difficult to make that jump to the next generation. So then I decided I wanted to see how much further I could go back. And so my goal was to see if I could find a photo of each of my great-great-grandparents. And so this took a little searching, and it took a few years. It took making connections with other family members, but eventually I was able to fill out my tree to my great-great-grandparents. So of course I didn't want to stop there, but I wanted to keep going as much as possible. And at this point, I have half of my third great grandparents also, and more than half if you include some adoptive third great grandparents. So I always am looking at those blanks where I don't have photos and I'm trying to think, well, who might have a photo? Where could I possibly find a photo? So just to give you a little preview of what I'll be talking about later too, it's not always photos of ancestors. We get to a point where there were no photographs taken because the first photograph was taken in 1839. And it took a couple decades for it to catch on. It was expensive. The daguerreotypes and the ambrotypes, the cased images, were not something just everyone could afford. So not everyone would have had their photo taken in those first couple decades of photography. But then if you get back to about 1860 or so is when the tintypes and the first paper photos were being introduced. And with these, it made it possible for people who maybe didn't have as much money to get photos taken. And I would imagine that most people who lived in the United States in the 1860s probably had their photo taken at some point because you could get your photo taken for a few cents. And now the issue is, was the photo labeled? Did it survive floods and fires and things like that? And did it not get thrown out also? Because people sometimes, they just think, well, no one cares about this old stuff, and so they get rid of it. So those are roadblocks, of course. But if people lived into the 1860s, I imagine their photo was fairly likely to have been taken. And so I do try to search and see what I can find. Like I said, there were other images also besides photos that were taken. And if you get back to earlier times, you might have paintings, you might have sketches, and even statues of some ancestors. And I'll talk about some things that I have found in my research. So I just love all old photographs, and I want to come to Philadelphia and see that one that Chris was talking about of the first photo taken in the United States, because I love that kind of thing. And so all old photos are just fascinating to me. And so some other types of photos, my presentation is about finding images of ancestors, but of course, I also want to find photos of collateral relatives. And that's an example of one that I have. If I can get a photo of their home, that's fantastic. Pets, that's my grandfather with his dog. I even have one where they labeled who the horse was. So that was Old Lee, and that belonged to my third great grandmother. Businesses that they owned. And I love the old photos that are very formal, no one's smiling, they're wearing their best clothes. To me, those are fantastic. I know people complain because they say, well, didn't anyone ever smile back then? But, it was a formal occasion. Not everyone had great teeth. Exposure times were long. You didn't want to look simple-minded in the only picture that was maybe going to be taken in your lifetime. So people often didn't smile. But then in the early 1900s was when people could have cameras of their own and take snapshots and get them developed themselves. And here's an example of a snapshot that I have. And So this is my grandfather who I never met, but here he is when he was in college. He and a buddy are dressed as women, and I have a series of photos where they're dressed like this and they're climbing in a dormitory window, and then they're getting apprehended by the administration of the college. And so this gives me some sense of my grandfather's sense of humor since I didn't know him. So to me, these are a real treasure. So as we're doing genealogical research, we always want to start at home and with our immediate relatives. And so that's what I did. We didn't have old photos at our house, but at my grandmother's house, at my grandparents' house, they had photos that were stashed away. They were under the stairs or they were in the basement. No one had looked at them for years and years and years. I really don't think my grandparents had any idea of what they had. They'd probably inherited photos from my great grandmother and had never even looked in the boxes. And so I started digging through these, and these were some of the photos that I was able to come across of some ancestors of mine. And the last one is from my wife's family. And so you just want to search in all those little shoe boxes and that are under beds or wherever they might be and see what you have to start with. You might be surprised. So then after that, I like to connect with distant cousins and those people who you haven't been in contact with for a while. And you want people to know that you're the person in the family who really wants to know about the family history, and you have answers to their questions about the family history because they're the one that they'll go to when they're trying to find out more, or maybe they come across things that they didn't know that they had. And so in my situation, my family, things have kind of funneled down to me because my sister and I just have one cousin. Both my parents had no cousins. And so I don't have any second cousins at all. And so things did kind of funnel down to us, but I also don't have a lot of other people who are fairly closely related to me to check in with. And so I had to go a bit further and mostly to third cousins or my parents' second cousins and people like that. And so one example of that, I had a second cousin of my father. When I was in college, we contacted him, and my father hadn't seen him since they were children. And he lived in South Dakota, and so we stopped by on a road trip and visited him, and we shared with him what information we found on the family. And he seemed mildly interested, I guess. And he thought that he had some things laying around somewhere, but he couldn't put his finger on where. And so we left it at that. Well, about 15 years later, we kept in contact, but he knew that I was still interested in the family history. And so he was moving into a retirement facility, and he didn't have any kids. And so he said, I found some boxes of old stuff. Do you want them? And I had no idea what that might be, but I said, sure, send it to me. I'll pay for postage. And so I got a couple boxes in the mail, and I couldn't believe what was in it. There were two of these big old Bibles that had photos in them. There were some old albums that were just covered with mold, and there were some letters. So as I started digging through it, it turned out to be quite a treasure. So this is another ancestor of mine, my third great grandfather, who also served out of Iowa in the Civil War. And he was taken prisoner in Mississippi and was never heard from again. And here's a photo of him, and it was labeled, and it was in the family Bible. And there's one of his wife, and they had 12 children. There were some of their kids. There are photos of them. There was a letter that he had written. But if that second cousin of my father's hadn't known that I was interested in the family history, I'm sure that stuff would have just ended up being thrown away or gone to Goodwill or something like that. So it's good that people know that you're the one who cares about these things. Another example, my grandmother, my maternal grandmother had a cousin who lived to be 101. My mother went to visit her when she was in her 90s, and I asked her to check and just see, does she have old photos? You know, can we share some family history with her? And so she was interested to learn some things about the family. And she did have some old photos. And so my mom got copies of some of those photos. And then this cousin passed away, and she also did not have any children. She had a stepson, though, and the stepson knew that I was into the family history. And so it took a while, but it was probably 10 years later, after she had passed away, that her stepson contacted me, and he said, well, I'm going through her things and there's a lot of old stuff here. Do you want it? And so I said, well, yeah, I'll take it. You know, I'll pay for postage. And so amongst the treasures in there, this is a photo. It's a tintype of my fourth great grandmother, and she was born in 1786. So 10 years after the start of the revolution. And I'm sure, again, that this probably would have been tossed if he didn't know that I was interested in the family history. So there were quite a few other photos that went along with this also, but it was pretty cool to get this photo of my fourth great grandmother. So another story where it's just a case of letting people know that you're interested. So my first slide showed my great-great-grandfather, Thomas Lykins, who was killed in the Civil War. And so he was killed when he was 22. He got married when he was 18, had two sons, one of whom he never met, and that was my great-grandfather. And so there were just these two sons. On my line, I'm descended from the one line. On the other line, there were 5 children, and then there were only 2 grandchildren, and neither of the grandchildren had any descendants. And so I had contacted one of the grandchildren on that other line of the family and had sent her some information on the family. And I said, you know, can you fill out a chart for me? And do you happen to have any old photos or anything? And she filled out the chart. She didn't seem super interested, but that's okay. Not everyone's interested in genealogy like we are. But so anyway, she wrote back and she said she didn't think she had any old photos or anything. I'm like, okay, that's fine. I tried. Well, about 10 years later, I got a call out of the blue. And it turns out that she had passed away. And I had never met her. I had only written that letter to her. And so she had a cousin. She had no children. She had a cousin on the other side of her family who was handling her estate. And as he was going through all of her things, he came across that letter that I had written to her years ago. And I was the only person that he knew of on the other side of the family. And so he said, there's some old photos here and things. Do you want them? And well, I said, sure. I had no idea what it might be because she said she didn't have anything. So I was afraid maybe it was going to be like 60 years of vacation slides or something like that. I really didn't know. Well, it turns out that I don't think she knew what she had. Maybe she had received a box when her parents had passed away and had never opened it. But it was unbelievable what was in there. One of the things was this photo. This is my great-great-grandfather and his wife. And this is probably their wedding photo taken about 1860. And there were just some incredible photos, family photos. My great aunt was a postmistress in Iowa, and this is a picture of her on the job, which is a pretty rare thing to have a photo like that. Just some fun photos, but included with this were 15 letters that Thomas Lykins had written to his wife during the last 3 months of his life during the Civil War. And I had no idea that these would have existed. My great-grandfather had been orphaned, and so it just is amazing to me that these things were even preserved. But there were 15 letters from the Civil War, and there are about 15 letters from other members of the family at that time that are just incredible and just really bring this family to life. So again, it was just a case where I got my name out there, and it was just amazing that someone happened to find that letter and took the time to actually contact me and to not throw these things away, but to send them to me. So you never know what's out there. I would have never guessed these things even existed. So sometimes I kind of target my research to try to contact distant cousins from people who might be keepers of the family treasures. And I often look at other lines that are kind of like mine, where things are kind of funneling down because maybe there's an only child and another only child. And then you kind of know where things are going, because if you have a family where they had 10 kids and then each of those had 10 kids, things get scattered and it's hard to follow. So I kind of try to be strategic as I contact people and try to find family information, and especially photos. And so I use online directories, obituaries, Facebook, any way that I can connect with people. So a situation with this, there was, it was a second cousin of my father who I had met her once before when I was young, hadn't been in contact, and she had a fairly unusual name. So I tried to find her on Facebook, and sure enough, she was on there. And so I sent her a message, and it took a little while, but she replied to it. I explained who I was and people that we knew in common, and she was glad to hear from me. And I shared a bunch of information about our family back in Norway and Sweden, and so she was pretty interested in that. And I shared some photos, and I asked her if she knew of any photos. And she thought she had some of her grandfather, and she found those and scanned them and sent them to me, which was really cool. Now, I was really hoping that she'd have a photo of her great-grandparents, because those are my third great-grandparents and people I didn't have a photo of. But they lived into the early 1900s, so I knew they had to have had their photos taken at some point. So she dug a little bit more, and she came across this photo. And this is the Erickson family in about 1880. And you can see it's kind of rough. It's been through some rough times over the years, with a tear and some scratches. And so these, let me get my pointer out here. So these are my third great-grandparents, Olaf and Johanna, and then 4 of their children. And they actually had 5 children. And so the funny thing is, the 5th child, who's actually the oldest and is my ancestor, is in this photo that's being held by the one daughter here. Well, so she sent that to me, and I was absolutely thrilled that this photo existed. And then a little bit later, she said, "Oh, I found another version of that same photo." And so here is the other version of the photo. It's been colorized, and 1880s style colorized, not computer colorized. And you'll notice that my second great-grandfather appears in the photo right here. So he's been photoshopped in 1880s style. And let me just go back again. So that's the original, and this is with him added in. And you can see he doesn't quite fit the rest of them with It's kind of flat looking, but it's not bad. So anyway, this is very cool because in 1880 is when my great-great-grandfather left Norway to come to the United States to scout things out for the family. And the family was going to come the next year to America, the rest of the family. And so probably they wanted their photo taken to leave copies with family in Norway. And so they had their photo taken, but they wanted Hans in the photo also. So he was photoshopped in. And so I just love the story that this photo tells. So another example, using obituaries, I was able to find descendants of my Murphy family, and I exchanged information with this distant cousin, and she was really excited to get more information on the family. And I had a lot of photos on the Murphy family because that's one line that a lot of things have been preserved. But I didn't have this photo, and so she had this one. This is my great-great-grandmother with her sisters. This was taken about 1910. And so with this photo, it's a little hard to see here maybe, but it's labeled, which is great because not all old photos are labeled, but how they labeled it was they wrote right across the blouse the name of each of the women, which isn't my favorite way to identify photos, but it's much better than having no identification on a photo. And using this photo, I was able to identify a ton of other photos that I had of these women, but I just wasn't sure which one was which sister and that. So it was really a great find. And a couple fun things that came with this. So again, this is my second great-grandmother, and this is a close-up of her. And two things. One thing, instead of her name was Flora, but it says Aunt Duck across her blouse. So apparently she was known as Aunt Duck to other family members, and I have no idea what the story is that goes with that. I'd love to know that someday. Another thing, she's wearing a pocket watch, and my mother actually has this pocket watch still. So it was really fun to find that in the photo. So again, it's just reaching out to people. I think one of the most rewarding parts of doing genealogy is just connecting with other family members. And sometimes they don't have the same passion for research that you have, but I found sometimes it stirs it up in them. And often people have thanked me and said, thanks for making me dig through what I had in the basement, because now I know what I have and realize what it is. And so not everyone responds that way. Some people don't care and won't respond. But when people do respond, it can be very rewarding. So in my grandparents' basement, there were quite a few photos that were not labeled. And this is really common. These are all tin types, which are difficult to label. And even if they're in a paper sleeve, people didn't always label the sleeves. And so these were ones that, I would think, well, how am I ever going to know who these people are? But by connecting with other family members who had similar photos or even copies of the same photo, I've been able to identify quite a few old photos. And so this one is one that I got from my grandfather's cousin. And so you can see it's the same people as in these photos, and it's even taken the same day. So they're individual photos that were taken, and the one below is their wedding photo. And then on my Murphy family, this is one that a cousin of mine had, a distant cousin of mine had, and you can see it's another version of the same photo. So I was able to identify that one. And so don't throw photos away thinking you'll never know who the people are, because someone might have that other copy of the photo. So I just try to use all kinds of resources. I use Ancestry, MyHeritage, RootsWeb, Facebook, Find a Grave, Dead Fred, Ancient Faces, Family Search, you name it, I try to use it. And I do have a list in the handout that has ideas of places to go to find these types of things. And so a couple that I want to mention. So this one came from Dead Fred. And so Dead Fred is a website where someone has created this website to help people connect with old photos that, so like if I have an old photo that maybe isn't my line of the family, or maybe it's a photo of a neighbor of my ancestors or something like that, and I want to find a home for it, I can post it on there, and then other people can access it, they can download copies of it, and I can even send it to them if it's one that I'm not interested in keeping myself. And so sometimes I put photos out there because there's an unusual name and I think maybe someone will come across that name and contact me. So I did that with name Barum, which is from Norway, and it's pretty uncommon. And so I've posted a photo of my great grandmother's cousins on there. And several years later, I was contacted by a descendant of one of those women. And so we exchanged information, we exchanged photos, and this is one of the photos that I got in the exchange. And so it was really fun to connect with her. So another one is Find a Grave. I'm sure many of you are familiar with Find a Grave. And often, it's the photo of the grave marker that's there. But sometimes people put photos of the individuals if they have them. And so this is an example of a photo that I found of a family member. Actually, there were several that were posted on Find a Grave. And so of course, I contacted them and we were able to exchange more information outside of what was posted. And another one, so RootsWeb, these days it's not active, but RootsWeb used to have message boards where you could post queries and you could look for distant relations and exchange information. So I did this for an area of Norway that my family's from. I posted that my family lived on this certain farm in this area of Norway. And, if you're a descendant, let me know. I'd love to exchange information with you. And so again, it took years before I heard anything, but eventually I did hear from a distant cousin. And well, the funny thing was he was in Denmark and I had no idea that part of the family had gone to Denmark. So we started exchanging photos with each other. We were scanning photos and sending them back and forth by email. And so I sent him this photo. And so in this photo, this gentleman here is my third great grandfather, Torkel Glikson. And this was identified by my great great aunt who lived to be 101 years old. And I thought, well, if Aunt Bertie doesn't know who the other people are, no one's going to know, because she didn't know who they were. And it was actually taken in Norway. Well, it turns out that cousin Lars, who I got in contact with, had a copy of the exact same photo. And so with his and mine put together, we were able to identify who everyone was. And it turns out it's siblings. And it was taken in 1906. And we know that because this one had moved to the United States. And in the Ellis Island records, we know that he went back to Norway in 1906 to visit family. And so it was fantastic to know who these people are. Another example of identifying photos that you think will never get identified. So, and a cool thing is he had a lot of photos, and he even had photos of my family that lived in the United States that none of the descendants on this side of the ocean have copies of, because our ancestors, they would send photos back to the old country to show, this is what we look like, this is our home, this is what we're wearing, things like that. And so they would share photos back to Europe, or and then So that's where we found this photo. So this photo was taken in Minneapolis. So this is, again, my third great grandfather, the same gentleman here, but quite a bit younger. And again, this is one that we didn't have ourselves. And he also had a photo of a generation going back further than that. So these are Torkel Glikson's parents, and this was taken in the 1860s, and they would have been born in the very early 1800s. So it was really fantastic to get that photo. All right, so I think Facebook can be a great tool to use. Facebook has its problems, but it can be a great tool for research. And so I suggest joining Facebook groups that are related to families, localities, and topics that you're researching. And so some examples of this, family groups. So the Woodburn family, this is my grandmother's family. I contacted descendants of my great-great-grandparents on that line and set up this group on there so we can share photos and stories. And it's been a lot of fun just to be able to connect with distant cousins this way and just tell stories about the family and things like that. For my wife's family, there's a Stein family one. So also for localities. So Colfax, Indiana is a historical society, so I belong to theirs. I have a lot of family from Colfax, Indiana, from this area of Norway, Redfield, Iowa. So you'll notice there's no standardization to these names at all. So you just have to search and see what's out there. So for example, for this one, I just did a search on Redfield, Iowa. And so this happened to come up. But yeah, there's no standardization to it. So this is a county in Ohio that I have family from. The Forgotten Iowa Historical Society just has all kinds of interesting, weird things about Iowa history that are posted there. An area of Sweden that my family's from. So you just never know if there's a group or not and if it's active, but it's worth trying to find those types of things. And then for other topics, the Civil War photo sleuth. If you have Civil War ancestors, you definitely should check this out. They also have a website. It's really worth checking out. Norwegian genealogy, eBay genealogy. It's things that people are posting on eBay. Swedish Portraits is a fantastic site. They have, I think it's in the hundreds of thousands, the portraits of Swedish folks that they have pictures of. So it's really worth checking out. And I've used Facebook groups to find out information about antiques, just all kinds of topics. If you can find a niche of something that interests you, there are interesting discussions that go on about these types of things. And you can always set up your own group in Facebook too. There are no restrictions on setting up a group. Well, there are probably some restrictions, but anyone can set up a group in Facebook. So if you have a topic that you'd like to start a group with that's just for your own family, you can certainly do that. So that's just one of the tricks I've used. And so from my Woodburn family, this is a photo that I got just this past year from a cousin in that group. And these are my third great grandparents with their children. And by far the best picture that I have of them. So that was a really great find. And this is one from my wife's family. So you never know what connections you might make. All right, so with all things with genealogy, we always want to think critically and be very careful. You know, when you go to an online family tree, we all know that some of the information out there is good and a lot of the information out there is not good. It hasn't been researched carefully. People are making suppositions that aren't well-founded. So you don't just want to add everything to your family tree, assuming it's correct. It's the same with photos. You always want to think critically. Is this really the person that it says it is, that people are saying it is? Is it the right time period and all that kind of thing? So this is an example of that. A number of years ago, I had a distant cousin who was all excited. They sent me this photo, and this is a carte de visite, and probably taken about 1860 to 1865, somewhere in there. And she said, these are our 5th great grandparents, Abraham and Eve Stuckey. And I looked at it and I thought, well, that is a really cool photo, but there's no way that it is who she thought it was. And so here's the reason. The Stuckeys were born in the 1770s and 1780s. By 1860, when this type of photo was first becoming available, they would have been, well, you can see when they died. So they would have just maybe barely been in the time period where they could have had this type of photo taken, but they would have been in their 70s and 80s at that period of time. And so this couple, they're maybe in their 20s or 30s at the oldest, I would guess. So there's no way that it is them. These people did not live late enough to have a photo like this taken. And so with any photo, you want to consider what is the history or the provenance of the photo. So how have you received it? Who has it been passed down through? And who identified it? So knew from the handwriting on the back of this that it was identified by my great-grandmother's cousin, who lived a long time ago, but not long enough ago to know these people. And she was just making a guess because on the back of the photo, it had the name of the town where the photo was taken in Ohio. But so she was assuming that because this couple lived in that part of Ohio, that this photo was of them. But it was too big of a jump. It really wasn't a good guess. And so you want to consider the type of photo it is, the dress of the people in the photo, the hairstyles, all those types of things. There are some great books out there about how to identify photos and the ages of photos. Maureen Taylor has a lot of books like this, and I have a list in the handout too, so you can check those out. And then just a reminder, whenever you have a photo and you know who is in it, label it as to who's in it, but also say, like, how did you receive it? You know, who was it passed through? Was it from your grandmother or what? Because that history is going to be interesting to people in the future. So one place to look for photos is eBay. There's a lot of things get posted on eBay that people no longer want, or they've gone to estate sales, or they've been at Goodwill or something like that. And so on eBay, you can set up an ongoing search for locations where your family lived or for unusual surnames. And when you set up a search, then you get a notification every time something new appears on eBay that meets that search. So you have to be careful with this, because if your last name is Smith, you don't want to do this for Smith, because you're going to get just way too many hits. And if you have family from Philadelphia, again, you're going to get way too many hits. But what I do is I have a lot of people from Colfax, Indiana, which is a very small town, but I had a lot of people there. And so I do a search on Colfax, Indiana, and I get a notification whenever something comes up that matches the search criteria. I also do my surname because it's very unusual, and actually probably all people in the United States who have my surname are related to me in one way or another. And so I get notifications every day from eBay. and 99.9% of the time, it's nothing I want, or it's not a good hit for me. But every once in a while, you'll have a good connection. And so this is an example of that. This is for my surname Lykins. One day, this group of photos all came up, and they were selling them for, I think, $80 or something like that. They were all labeled. And so it turns out this is not my line of the family, but I had recently gotten in contact with someone who was from that line of the family. And so I emailed him. I said, John, you definitely want to check this out. And he went on there and he immediately bought them all. And I'm so glad he ended up with them, because they're really fantastic photos, and ones that he did not have photos of before. So you never know what you'll find. I honestly haven't found a whole lot for my own family, but sometimes I find things for friends and things like that too. So that works out. All right, also just doing searches using search engines like Google. These are ones that I found that way. So just things on family histories, local archives that are indexed in Google. Sometimes you'll find things. So it's worth a shot, just seeing what comes up. All right, also check out library sources for photo collections, newspapers, yearbooks, histories of counties, towns, churches, schools, and other organizations. So there's not always a lot of standardization to how these things are. So you have to learn about the locality where your family's from and what kind of resources are available. But these are some things I found through these types of sources. In newspapers, obituaries would often have photos of people. And so that's an example of one of those. This is a second great-grandfather of mine, and his photo that's in county history. And this one's from a county atlas in Indiana, and a sketch of my family's farm there. And so these are all just ones that I found through libraries. And then a lot of things are being digitized these days. And so this can be on the local, the state, the national level, or it can be a topical archive. So again, there's not always a lot of standardization to how these things are organized. Sometimes it's a local historical society, sometimes it's a local genealogical society. And historical society, you just have to investigate the locality and see what is available. But this is one that actually was in the National Archives. This is a relative of mine, not from my direct line, but it was kind of cool. It was in the National Archives. And just another search of databases. This is from the Smithsonian. And this is a relative of mine who had made a quilt around 1830, and that quilt is in the Smithsonian. I would have never guessed that this would exist. And so when my family and I went to Washington, D.C. a few years ago, we actually went behind the scenes, and we contacted the textile curator and were able to see the quilt. So that was kind of cool. And also just, this is an example of a town that my family lived in Colorado. And a business of one of them is in the photo, but also just what a great picture of what life was like at that time. And just, this is this mining town in the mountains, and you can see all the mud and the smoke and everything, and the types of buildings that were around at that time, and how people dressed. And it just adds a lot of life to your family history when you can find things like this. And sometimes we have ancestors who were photographed for other reasons. And so this is my wife's family, and this is her great-grandfather. Ernst Blumenthal. And so just through doing a Google search, I came across this. And funny thing is, we didn't know that he'd ever lived in Colorado even. And because we thought he'd spent most of his life in Nebraska. Well, it turns out he did live in Colorado for a bit of time, and it was during Prohibition, and he had a still. And so he ended up in the Colorado State Prison. And so we were able to get this photo from the Colorado State Archives of Ernst Blumenthal. And we really had no idea about this. My wife's father did not know about this at all. And I did some further research on him, and I found out this wasn't his first time. And so here's from the Nebraska State Archives. Here he is as a younger man. And this time he was in for highway robbery, and he stole a watch from a guy on the highway or on the road at that time. And he shot at the guy, and it grazed him. And thankfully that guy wasn't killed. My wife's ancestor would have probably ended up in prison for life, and my wife would have never been born. So anyway, this turns out to be one of the best photos that we actually have of Ernst Blumenthal. So you never know. Ancestry does have a lot of California mugshots in it, but also state archives are often a place to go if you have people who are in the state prison system. All right, and I'd mentioned there comes a point where you're beyond where there were photographs taken. And so if we have an image, it's going to be in some other form. And so this is an example of that. My quest was to find a painting of Anne Carter, who's my 5th great grandmother. And when I was doing research back in the 80s at the Denver Public Library, I came across a history of Quakers of Northern Virginia. And this was written in 1934. And so in the book, it says, this person's writing, "I have a portrait of Anne, wife of James Carter. It's painted in the costume of the Friends, or the Quakers. And it has what is the inscription on the back there. And so this Carter family, they were from the Philadelphia area also, Quakers, of course. And so I thought, well, I have to find this painting if it still exists. And so the last I knew, in 1934, it was still with the family who had the painting. And so I posted things, queries on boards. I did searches with historical societies and databases, and nothing came up. But I kept searching. And well, it turns out that the family that owned it donated it to the Virginia Historical Society a few years back. And so I did another search, and all of a sudden it came up. And so I contacted them and was able to get a copy of it. And so this is from the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. And this is Anne Carter. And so this would have been painted in about 1820, and she was born in 1734. So that was really fantastic to get an image of someone from that early. And this type of painting is what we would call a primitive. It wasn't Rembrandt or anything like that, but still, it was very cool to be able to see something of what she looked like. Well, it turned out that that was not the only painting of family members in that line. And it turns out that they also had paintings of James and Rachel Carter, who are on my line. So those are my 4th great grandparents. And then there were paintings of a couple of their children, which are not of my line, but still it was really fun to be able to see these paintings and see what these people looked like and how they dressed and all that kind of thing. So So another kind of similar story, an ancestor of mine, Leonard Eckstein. He was a very interesting character. He was born in Bavaria, and he had very strong religious views, which did not go along with the people in power in Bavaria at that time. He ended up in prison and escaped, and he came to the New World, and he was also in Philadelphia for a time before moving into Virginia. Turns out he had a grandson named Leonard Case, and he was the founder of Case Western Reserve University in Ohio. So I contacted their archives to see if they had any family information, and it turned out that they did. And so in the family information, it said that there was a sketch of Leonard Eckstein. And so I continued to be in contact with them, and eventually we were able to come up with this sketch. And so there's Leonard Eckstein. And I was super excited to find this. My wife saw it and she said, "Oh, it looks like he was a hobbit." But so she wasn't as excited as I was. But anyway, I thought it was awfully cool. One of the things that I learned from the things that had been written about this family, it said that Leonard had a brother who was an artist in the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia. And I thought, well, that sounds like kind of a stretch, because my family that descended from him, they were farmers for generations and not fancy people. But through further research, I discovered it actually was true. And so the university archives also came across these. And so that's Johannes Eckstein and his wife. Johannes was indeed in the court of Frederick the Great of Prussia. And after Frederick the Great died, he did come to Philadelphia also. And so these were some other family members that were in this collection. And so it was really fun to be able to find these. And then an additional thing that was noted was that there was another brother in this family who was also an artist. He moved to London and he made a statue of Leonard Eckstein's father. And so I thought, well, I have to find out what happened to the statue. And so in the archive collection, they had a very rough photo of this sculpture. It was not in good shape at all. And so I thought, well, hopefully it still exists somewhere. And so by searching, I discovered that actually it does still exist, and it was no longer in London, but it had come to the collection at Yale, the Yale Center for British Art. And so this is my sixth great-grandfather, Conrad Eckstein, and this statue is about this tall, so it's less than a foot tall, so it's not large, but it does still exist. And so this is, my ancestor was born in 1689, so who would guess, not being of royal blood, to find an image of an ancestor this far back was pretty exciting for me. So that is the furthest back that I go at this point. And so one thing I wanted to mention was myheritage.com has come out with a number of photo tools, which I find to be quite interesting, and I've played around with them quite a bit. One of them is a photo enhancer, and just to show you an example of that, this is, again, my third great-grandfather, George Knoll, who was taken prisoner in the Civil War. And so this is the photo that I have of him, and then putting it through MyHeritage's photo enhancer, it takes just a few seconds, and this is what comes out. So, it doesn't always work that well with all photos. Sometimes it kind of mutates them a bit, but but with some of them, it turns out really nice, and it's interesting just to see a sharper image. So another example of a tool that they have is their photo colorizer tool. And now I have to say, I love the original sepia tone photos, and I actually probably prefer those, but it is interesting to see photos colorized sometimes, and I find that it makes them more interesting to people who maybe um, aren't as fascinated by old photos as I am. And this is an example of that. So this is a photo of my a great great aunt of mine who was the first woman driver in Benton County, Indiana, back about 1910, and that's her father's car. And so you can see it kind of brings it to life. And an interesting thing too is sometimes details show up that you don't see otherwise. And so here is another woman who's leaning against the car with her back to the car with her hands behind her head. And I would have never even noticed that in the original if it hadn't been colorized. So sometimes it helps you find details that you don't see otherwise. So that's kind of fun. They also have tools to animate photos, which can be very interesting. Some people think it's creepy. It just depends. Sometimes it works better than other times. But and then just I think this week they came out with a new one for photos that have tears in them and scratches, and it will erase those. Not perfectly, but it does a fairly decent job with it. So those are some tools that I use sometimes, and might be interesting to you if you're interested in old photos like I am. I also wanted to mention I do have an Instagram page. It's called Glimpses of the Past. If any of you are interested in checking it out, it's just old photos and of my family. And I try to post a little story to go along with them. And so my page is called Glimpses of the Past, all run together as one word. And so if you're interested, I'd welcome you to take a look at that. So at this point, I have photos of, I believe, 55 of my ancestors, or images of 55 of my ancestors. I have a number of other ones where I'm like 90% sure that it's this person, but I just can't prove it until I find that other cousin who has another copy of it. I won't know for sure, but I do keep searching. It gets slower and slower as I get further back, but I still have high hopes. I'm going to find some more images of some more ancestors. And I hope that this has given you an idea of some places you might look. Again, I really recommend just connecting with other family members, connecting with those distant cousins, and just sharing. And to me, that's one of the most rewarding things, is developing relationships with these other people who come from the same family, and just being able to exchange information and photos with them. So I wish you all the best on your continued research. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen here.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Yeah, that was really interesting, and uh, you know, just one of the just a quick aside. One of the things that I found here at HSP, when you had mentioned, some of the libraries and historical societies, HSP ended up with a bunch of fire insurance company records,
Oh,
and what we found was a lot of times those records end up having an image of the house.
mm,
So so, you know, but like you said, there's no standard or anything like that, unfortunately. But
Uh-huh.
you know, uh, I don't know. It wouldn't be a place I would think to look at, but we have found that a lot of those fire insurance records have, if it's not a photograph of the house, it's a somebody may have sketched it or something like that, which is pretty cool.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Yeah. That's a great example. I hadn't even thought of before. So
Yeah, it was something that I wasn't aware of until I came to HSP and found it really interesting. But there's a lot of good information, and we've gotten already a lot of comments on they found a lot of the information very helpful. We do have a couple questions, and you kind of touched on this um, already, but somebody had asked, you know, regarding photos of the family that you shared. Um, you know, I guess how many of those would you say had identifying information, and how many would you kind of have to do that extra step on, and you know, and how long would that have taken you?
yeah, it varies all over the place. I've gotten albums from some people. I mentioned the one where I got a couple Bibles and an album, and someone had taken the time, probably it was probably my grandfather's cousin had taken the time to label things, and it was fantastic. And then most of the stuff in my grandparents' basement, no one had ever labeled it. You know, they just assumed, oh, well, we know who these people are. And so they didn't take the time to label them. And so that's where it's taken a lot of extra work to connect with other people who had pictures of the same people. And that's enabled me to identify them. So it varies all over the place, but I do still have a ton of photos that I don't know who they are. And I just, I think we all do.
Right.
So yeah, and with those early photos too, it was difficult, you know, on a tintype, it's difficult to write on it. And so people didn't. And so it's a pretty common thing, I think.
Great. No, thank you. And actually, that another person asked, you know, what do you recommend for adding names and stories to these photographs?
Okay. Yeah, so it depends. You know, if it's on paper, um, I do like to label the photo itself so it doesn't get separated from, you know, an identification of it. And but you just want to be very careful. I recommend using a soft pencil, um, maybe writing, you know, on the back in a corner, not like on the face of someone or something like that, you know, on the opposite side of their face or something, so you dent it or anything like that. You know, just being very careful, but it is good to label it on the photo if possible. I have some, like I mentioned, tintypes are difficult to label that way, and so I might. Well, what I often do is I do a lot with archival boxes and plastic sleeves and things like that, and so like I buy a lot of these types of plastic sleeves to protect them, and then I'll put them in an archival box, you know, like this
Hmm.
type here,
Right.
and so that, you know, they're all neat. And then if I need to put in extra information like this one, it has a piece of paper in with it that was actually a label that was stuck in a photo album that was with it, and so I put that with it. And so, you know, it just kind of depends. If I have a cased image, like this is an example of one that I talked about. And so with this one, I can't write on it. And so what I do is I put in an archival box, and then I put in a paper that goes with it that has a copy of the photo on it. And then I write about the photo on there. So it gets separated from this photo. People know this is the one I'm talking about. And then I always scan everything. So I have a scanned copy of every one of my photos so that um, I have that backup too, and it's saved in the cloud. So if my house burns down tomorrow, these won't all be lost, but be able to access them still. So those are some of the ways that I do it.
Great. Thank you. And actually, we just got another question that came in and said, are the sleeves you buy, are they a special kind of sleeve, special kind of plastic?
Yeah, so what I do is I buy them from, there are a number of companies. There's Light Impressions, there's Gaylord Archival. There's others I'm not thinking of off the top of my head, but if you just Google like archival products and things like that, there are companies that specialize in these types of things, and they often cater to historical societies and libraries and that, but individuals can buy them from them also. And so, yeah, you just want something that is not, I don't know, if, like in the 70s, those magnetic albums were real popular where you stick them under the plastic and then they're glued in. And those are just the worst for archival preservation of things because things stick to them and you couldn't get them off and they're not acid free. You want to be
Right.
sure that things are acid free. So yeah, you just, that's what I do. Yeah.
Great. Great. Yeah, and one of our viewers had mentioned the Hollinger and archival methods are also good places to check as well.
Right. Yeah, that's
But
good.
So I think that looks like that's all the questions for tonight. But again, I wanna thank you for the presentation. It was really interesting. And thank you for joining us